Some call it blasphemy. I call it honesty. Belief in God may be good for some, but for me, it is not good enough. If I'd believe in God, still I'd be restless. I'd need to know, what is this God in whom I believe? Actually, it's a kind of test, a probe of God. I know God's traditional traits in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. A conscious, personal, supreme being who is all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good. But I want to push further. What is God's private mental life? What would it feel like to be God? Am I wanting too much, going too far? I'm Robert Lawrence Kuhn, and Closer to Truth is my journey to find out. What is God's inner sense? God's subjective, internal awareness? I hear the chorus of critics. God is so far superior to humans. How can we know anything about the reality of God? Least of all, what it feels like to be God. I cannot answer. Still, I'm undeterred. Push to the limits this idea of God. See what emerges. That's the test. I begin at Oxford, Oriel College, with the Nolloff Professor of the Philosophy of the Christian Religion, an authority on the nature and necessity of God, Brian Leftow. Brian, in order to know whether there really is a God, I want to understand what that God is like. So I'm going to ask you an unusual question, in that if God exists, what is it like to be God? What does God feel like in God's own being?
I think we can know something about what it feels like to be God. Part of that comes from, if you start as a Christian, you believe that the best thing that can happen to us, the most joyous thing, the most beautiful thing, is the beatific vision, the actual vision of God. We're only ever going to see a bit of it. We're never going to really comprehend the whole. So if it's that great to see just a bit, it's got to be a lot greater to see the whole. And that's what God sees. And so if the beatific vision is a great thing for us, we can infer from that, I think, that it feels great to be God. Beyond that, well, God knows absolutely everything. And whereas we sometimes don't think about the things we know, God's infinite and perfect mind always has all of his knowledge in mind at once. And so it's like a constant eureka, because he's seeing all the truth. Furthermore, God always feels, at least according to Christian belief, limitless love toward his creatures. And sometimes he is intimately aware of the fact that some of us love him back. And so there's, the moment where you love somebody and you realize they love you back. Well, there's that infinitely, forever. So there's the beatific vision, there's the infinite eureka, there's the infinite love.
There's also a great deal of suffering in the world. People suffer all the time, and if you look at evolution, untold billions of creatures suffered terribly. God must suffer as well.
Some theologians have held that God is impassible, that he has no negative emotions at all. I don't believe that myself. I think that if we suffer and God is aware of our suffering and God loves us, there must be some negative experience in God that corresponds to that. So a fuller understanding of what God's experience would be like, I think, would be to say that it's thoroughly mixed. There's all the good stuff that I just mentioned, and there's also the negative feelings that go with appreciating the sufferings of his creatures. However, God's perspective on creaturely suffering has to be different than ours, because he sees not just what's going on now, but the ends for which it serves. And so his perception of the suffering is mitigated by the fact that he's always seeing it in the context of the good for the sake of which it's allowed.
If I knew everything and I could do everything, then I, in one sense, would have nothing to look forward to. I would have no sense of excitement about the future, and I have no ability to be creative and no ability to achieve anything. That is a significant deficit.
If God is temporal, Many people would argue that he couldn't really know the future. If that's true, then he doesn't know exactly what's coming in all its details. Some of it is left for us to work out, and some of it we work out in partnership with him. So that part is certainly something he can be creative about, can have expectations about, can learn about as time goes on, if he's temporal.
But you don't believe that.
Right. I think that God is atemporal. So what I would say is this. Even within an atemporal being, some things presuppose other things. Some people say that the truths of mathematics are atemporal, and some people say that you can arrange some of the truths of mathematics, at least in an axiomatic system, in which certain premises would dictate certain conclusions. If both those things are right, some atemporal truths are based on other atemporal truths. If God is atemporal, everything in him is there, so to speak, all at once. But some things presuppose other things. That's not learning some things after others, but it is having a quality in his experience that would not have been there otherwise had he not had certain aims, planned time to go a certain way, and then seen from outside of time that it does go more or less that way. So there's something like creativity, something like learning, even in an atemporal God, because there's some knowledge that is there only because of logically prior intentions, plans, and execution.
So it's good to be God?
Definitely.
It's good to be God. Yes, I suppose it is. All knowledge, all truth, all at once. Enjoying to the utmost ultimate power and pure love. But these are God's traits, capacities God has, not what God is. Can we probe deeper, access God's nature, discern God's mind? Still in Oxford, I visit the former Regius Professor of Divinity, philosopher and priest Keith Ward.
So we're just going to use reason.
Keith is not afraid to speculate about God.
The interesting thing for me about God is it involves every fundamental philosophical question. And one of them is freedom, another one is the nature of time, and the other one is, of course, the place of consciousness in reality. So what I think about God from a philosophical point of view is that God has a sort of temporality. Now, that's pretty unorthodox. I mean, a lot of people who believe in God say God is beyond time, God is timeless. But if God is timeless, then it's difficult to see how God can relate to anything in the world where one thing happens after another, but God is stuck, but can't do anything. And so I bite the bullet and say God is temporal, but not confined to our time. You can speak of a sequence of events in the mind of God, one thing after the other. First of all, God does this, then God does that. So it's not clock time, it's not measurable time. It's that there are events in the life of God which succeed one another.
Do you see God as a person, as if it were an individual, as opposed to some amorphous cosmic consciousness that many Eastern religions talk about?
I see God as an individual, a unified consciousness with knowledge of every possible world, and a will, a causal power, which is not physical. I'm a bit reluctant to use the word person. Personal, yes, because God has thoughts, God has intentions, yes, and knowledge, and I think feeling in a certain sense.
Some of those things sound anthropomorphic to...
Yes.
We're projecting onto a super being that which we have only more.
Yes. Well, that's right. But isn't that what we all do in our theories about the universe? You're going to have to start from something you know about and inflate it until it encompasses the universe. If the objection is that God is a projection of our minds onto the universe, I accept that. And I think if you're going to talk about the ultimate nature of the universe, any theory will be a projection of some part of us. The question is it going to be the material part or the mental part? God doesn't think as we do. I mean, God doesn't work out mathematical sums, I presume, and God has knowledge of every possible state of affairs. So God's mind, philosophers usually say, is intuitive. It encompasses everything that could be encompassed at all. So it's a very different sort of mind. There is a question whether that makes sense. Well, I don't see why not, I suppose, since I'm not binding the mind to the brain. I think you could inflate the concept. That's what you're doing, and saying, could you have a mind which knew everything and which could, if it wished, intend everything? And I do think that's a possibility. And then you ask, are there reasons for making that move? And I think there are. Yes. All said to be intelligent and blissful, and those are
To Keith, God personifies every philosophical issue, such as time and consciousness, and answers every philosophical question. Time is real and consciousness is unified. It's a nice way to represent God. Take what we know, inflate it beyond measure, approach the mind of God. Then, having hints of the mind of God, try to imagine what it might feel like for God to have such a mind. If God is a unified consciousness and exists in time, experiencing real temporality, that makes God something like, well, us. Only vastly more, incomprehensibly more, but still like us. My reaction bifurcates. On the one hand, I recoil at creating God in our own human image. On the other hand, I strangely suspect that if there is a God, the human analogy would help. Since much of what we know comes from science, I go to Cambridge to meet a pioneer in science and theology, a quantum physicist who became an Anglican priest, John Polkinghorne. John, what is God like in God's own being? It sounds like this is going to sound strange, but what is it like to be God?
Well, that's a very hard question for a finite human being to answer. And in fact, there's a very strong tradition in theological thinking called apophatic theology, which says that finite beings can never really know what the infinite being of God is like. We can go know what God is not like, we can go know that God is not evil, and things like that, but we don't know positive things. Just taking that on its own would be a counsel of despair, but it's an important, I think, condition to bear in mind.
Fair enough.
I think we can learn something about God in two sorts of ways. One is we can learn God's nature by seeing the form of creation, which suggests a mind and a purpose and great power and authority in that sort of way. We have a picture of a God who can really bring into being and sustain in being things of value and purpose. But then what goes beyond that? I mean, does God really care? Is God just so big that we're beneath his concern? And here Christianity has a very particular and interesting answer. Christianity has as its central core the exciting, mysterious, and I believe true idea that God has acted to make God's nature known in the most accessible way for human beings by living a human life in Jesus Christ. So in one sense, the Christian answer is, if you want to know what God's like, see what Christ was like.
Okay, so we really have two ways of assessing God. One, in a personal sense, from the Christian point of view, looking at the life of Jesus, right. And secondly, looking at the natural creation. Right. If we look at the natural creation, there are characteristics of it. Certainly, probabilistics seem to work in quantum mechanics, evolution, right. And a whole sorts of things. What does that tell us about the mind of God?
Well, it tells us that God didn't bring into being a fixed world, a mechanism which is just going to unroll. That the creation is not the performance of a fixed score, which was written in eternity, but it's more like an unfolding improvisation, in which creator and creatures interact with each other.
We also see characteristics of creation which, from our perspective, looks like great evil. What does that say about the mind of God?
Well, that is the most difficult problem for theology, wrestling with the character of creation. In relation to human evil, we have what people call the free will defense, that it is better for God to have brought into being a world in which there are free creatures, even though they make terrible use of their freedom, than to have a world of perfectly programmed automata. I've suggested in terms of the process of nature, we see a world which is allowed to explore and bring to birth, in its own way, the fruitfulness with which God has endowed it. And I've called that the free process defense, that a world in which creatures make themselves is a better world than a ready-made world would have been. Evolutionary process is fruitful, but it also involves a great deal of suffering. Genetic mutation is the engine which has driven the 3.5 billion year history of life, turning a world of bacteria into a world with you and me. But if germ cells are going to mutate and produce new forms of life, somatic cells will also be able to mutate and produce cancer. So though the fact of cancer in the world is an anguishing fact about the world, it's not gratuitous. In my view, it's not a question of God being a little less callous or a little bit more competent, it wouldn't be there. It's the necessary cost of a world in which creatures make themselves. An important insight is that God is not simply a benevolent spectator of the suffering of creation, but Christians believe that in the cross of Christ, we see God as a participant in suffering. God knows suffering, human suffering, from the inside, not merely from the outside. That's a very profound and deep thought, and to me, meets the problem of evil and suffering at the sort of profound level that it needs to be met.
If indeed there is a God, then I'd agree that how the world works would provide insight into the mind of God. What would it feel like to have purpose, value, power, authority, but also to experience risk, awareness of evil, empathy with suffering? I worry about my question. What does it assume about God to even ask what would it feel like to be God? God is conscious, that's for sure. What about personhood? Must God be a person to have inner feelings? Here's how some philosophers of religion reason. Since being persons defines our human existence, maximum personhood defines God's maximum existence. I meet a philosopher who is an expert on how God relates to time, Gregory Ganssle.
The question of what it feels like to be God is going to trade on how similar is our experience of being persons to God's experience of being persons. If we have a philosophical view of what God's attributes are like, his personal attributes, things like God knows everything that can be known, God can do everything that can be done, God loves with the highest degree of sacrificial love, God is the standard for moral goodness, and then we can ask the question, do we taste any of these kinds of ingredients? We do know what it's like to know things. We do know what it's like to have the power to do things. We do know what it's like to love sacrificially. I believe our experience of happiness and joy and beauty also mirrors what it's like to be God. But there are vast differences in degree. God knows everything that can be known. God doesn't sit around wondering whether there's a highest prime number, right? He knows whether or not there's a highest prime number. Maybe he doesn't care very much about prime numbers, but God doesn't wonder what the best thing to do is, the way we often agonize. So while there's a continuity in our experience as persons, there's also a tremendous discontinuity in our experience of God. The question of whether God, knowing all these things and can do all things, indicates that he will grow bored is a question that many people have raised. But there's something dynamic about God's experience of God's own self. So I'm trying to think of an analogy. There are times when elements in my marriage are exploration. I'm learning more about my wife. There are other times when they're just the experience of being together, where it's not learning things I don't know, but it's a fullness of experience, and perhaps God's experience is like that.
God as a person, even as a maximal person. A person is, well, still a person. I hate it. God is lowered to human level existence. I love it. Humans are elevated to God-level existence. God as a person is so odd and yet so evocative. There's continuity. Thoughts, knowledge, beliefs, intentions, feelings. And discontinuity. Knows everything, can do anything, never in doubt. Can we really learn about God by learning about people? I pursue God as a person with an Australian philosopher of religion who suggests that God may be a developing being, Peter Forrest. Peter, what would it feel like to be God? Is that an absurd question?
No, I think it's a very good question, Robert. And my answer is, in some ways it would feel rather like it feels to be a human being. And the reason I say that is because there's this traditional philosophical worry about which of our sense capacities reveal the world as it really is. You know, all the stuff about, well, vision, the colours aren't sort of in the objects, they're just the way it seems. And if you ask me what senses reveal things as they are in themselves, I would say that one of the prime examples is that body awareness. And they're related things like kinesthesia, the knowledge of our own motion. But body awareness will do. So if we're to speculate as to God's knowledge of things, we need to ask, how does God know things? Not meaning, you know, how is it possible that God knows things, but meaning, in what kind of sense modality does God know things? Does God see things? Well, that doesn't sound very plausible, because seeing is from a point of view, somewhere between the eyes. Given what we know about our own sensations, the natural speculation is to say that God is aware of things in the same sort of way as we're aware of our bodies. That's how it feels like to God. So God's knowledge would be a kind of vast and detailed awareness of God's own body, like our awareness of our own bodies.
Now, as a pantheist, you believe that that all of reality, the universe, you use that term, is God's body. So does that make the analogy stronger? That if God knows his own body, which is the universe, the way we know the proprioception of our fingers without even looking at them, does that give a sense of how God is aware and how God feels?
When we're looking at how worthy a speculation is to be taken seriously, we do need to take into consideration Occam's razor. And so even if there might be other modalities that we know nothing about, what does it feel like to be God? It feels like feeling. I mean, you're aware of your own body.
You're not embarrassed to be called an anthropomorphic philosopher.
No, I mean,
Most people would be embarrassed.
I will say my philosophy is anthropomorphic, but it's not improperly anthropocentric. We start where we are, and we are aware of a lot, and science has told us a lot, and I'm a devout scientific realist. I believe it all. But we also are aware of ourselves. And these are as much facts about the world from which we start as the facts based upon repeatable observations from which the sciences start. So I'm not at all ashamed to be described as an anthropomorphic philosopher. And indeed, if I were to have a slogan, I would describe my speculations as properly anthropomorphic metaphysics. The best hypothesis I can produce is that God feels things like we feel things.
So God, if there is a God, would have a scintillatingly aware inner life. God experiences wholly and always the fullness of maximum greatness, the richness of unimaginable majesty. But to discern God by amplifying humans flies in the face of classic theology. Are finite humans forever restricted to know an infinite God only in the negative? Can we know only what God is not? I'd hope we'd do better. But even after maximally inflating all traits that we have, or we imagine, still, God must have categories of qualities unknown and unknowable. So what value the inquiry? I recall philosopher Edward Wierenga.
I don't know how important it is for God to have feelings. I think for the lives of some religious believers, they might find it helpful to think that God is experiencing what they're experiencing, that he's in it with them, and that might be a source of some comfort.
Yeah, I'm not interested in source of comfort. I want to believe what's true. Don't comfort me. Tell me what's true. If it makes me miserable, I'd rather be miserable.
What's involved in being a perfect being? That you never have any bad experiences? Or would part of being a perfect being be having appropriately bad experiences in response to appropriately bad stuff? One way of trying to settle that question is to figure out, well, really, what is involved in being a perfect being?
What gall? What effrontery? Minuscule created creatures examining, scrutinizing their creator, probing what it feels like to be a perfect being. I love it because that's closer to truth.
For complete interviews and for further information, please visit closertotruth.com.